Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about an old family picture from 1890 and the terrifying detail hidden within it that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know, where are you listening to this story from? That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. A photograph is a promise of truth, a moment captured and held against the relentless current of time. It is a silent witness, offering us a glimpse into a world that has long since vanished. But what happens when that promise is broken? What happens when the frozen reality it presents is not one of celebration, but of a quiet, meticulously staged, and unimaginable terror? This is the story of such a photograph, an artifact of silver and paper that, for over 130 years, kept its horrifying secret locked away, waiting in the dust and shadows for an eye sharp enough and a soul brave enough to decipher the truth that screamed from its silent surface. Our story begins not with a sound, but with a profound and heavy silence. It was a tangible thing, this silence, clinging to the air within the cavernous walls of the Whitmore estate in Salem, Massachusetts. For decades, the grand Victorian mansion had stood as a monument to stillness, its windows clouded with grime, like the vacant eyes of a corpse staring out at a world that had forgotten its name. The last of the Whitmore line had perished without an heir, and in doing so had inadvertently sealed the home like its time capsule, when its immense groaning doors were finally forced open for an estate sale. It was as if a long-held breath was finally exhaled, carrying with it the complex scent of decaying literature, dried flowers, and the faint, metallic tang of lives brought to an abrupt end. It was into this weighted silence that Rebecca Martinez stepped, a woman whose life was a conversation with the past. She had spent over 2 decades as an antique dealer, honing an almost psychic sensitivity to the objects she handled. She could read the biography of a life in the subtle scratches on a silver locket, or feel the lingering sorrow in the faded ink of a forgotten letter. Yet, the Whitmore mansion disturbed her on a level she had not experienced before. It wasn't the theatrical cobwebs that draped the gas chandeliers like ghostly shrouds, nor the oppressive weight of the dark, imposing mahogany furniture that seemed to absorb the very light from the room. It was a cold, a deep, resonant cold that had little to do with the crisp New England autumn air outside, but seemed to emanate from the very heart of the house itself. A psychic chill born of tragedy. She moved through the succession of dusty rooms, her practical boots making soft thuds on the priceless Persian rugs. Around her, other prospective buyers, a motley crew of opportunistic dealers and curious locals, chattered with a jarring lack of reverence. They saw only value, price tags, and profit. They were vultures, picking at the bones of a dead family's legacy, oblivious to the atmosphere that was making the hairs on Rebecca's arms stand on end. She, however, felt the house watching her. Her professional eye scanned past collections of period furniture, porcelain dolls with cracked faces, and shelves of leather-bound books, cataloging, appraising, and dismissing. She was looking for that one object that held the soul of the place. And then, in a dimly lit second-floor hallway, away from the main throng, she found it. It was an ornate wooden frame, its detailed carvings almost completely obscured by a century's worth of grime. And inside it, a family portrait. At first glance, it was utterly, almost painfully, typical of its time. A stern-looking family of 5, posed with the rigid formality demanded by the painstakingly long exposure times of 19th century photography. A distinguished patriarch with a thick, authoritative mustache stood sentinel behind his seated wife, his hand placed firmly on her shoulder. Their 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, were arranged around them like carefully placed chess pieces, in fading, elegant script at the bottom of the frame. A date was inscribed, 1890. But as Rebecca drew closer, leaning in so her breath misted on the glass, her professional curiosity began to sharpen into something else, something closer to disbelief, then to awe, and finally to a creeping dread. It was the quality of the photograph. It was impossible. Most images from that era were hazy, the details softened by the limitations of the technology into a dreamlike memory. But this one possessed a hyper-realistic clarity that felt anachronistic, almost modern. She could distinguish the delicate, individual threads in the lace on the mother's high collar, the subtle floral pattern of the wallpaper behind them, the very texture of the crushed velvet on the settee. It was less a photograph and more a window, a portal into that very room. The artist who had crafted this image was not merely a photographer. He was a master of light and chemistry. Yet, this technical perfection served only to amplify a profound and disturbing imperfection at its core. It was the eyes. Specifically, the eyes of the 3 children. They were not the vacant, patient stares of children enduring a tedious task. They were wide, fixed, and dark with an emotion that had no place in a cherished family portrait. Rebecca had seen thousands of old photographs, but she had never seen this. This was the look of a small animal mesmerized by an approaching predator it cannot escape. A primal, frozen terror that the lens had captured with an almost cruel fidelity. It was a silent, collective scream, trapped forever in a wash of silver gelatin. A question began to form in Rebecca's mind, a question that would burrow into her thoughts and refuse to leave. What kind of artist, what kind of man, points a camera at a terrified child and, instead of putting it down, chooses to create a masterpiece? What dark stage play were these unwilling actors a part of? Just moments before the final curtain fell. To understand the chill that crept from that photograph and into Rebecca's very soul, one must first understand the world that created it. The year 1890 sat near the glittering, feverish zenith of America's Gilded Age. It was an era of explosive growth and dazzling, dangerous contradictions, a crucible of progress and poverty, particularly in the industrial heartlands of New England. It was an age that forged immense fortunes in the roaring fires of textile mills and the relentless, deafening clatter of factories. Great cities like Boston were expanding at a frantic pace, their skylines pierced by new monuments to commerce, their streets humming with the raw energy of invention and ambition. This was the America of the nouveau riche, of opulent mansions rising in the countryside, of families like the Whitmores ascending from middle-class obscurity to the ranks of the wealthy elite in a single, breathless generation. But the gilding of the age was just that, a thin, seductive layer of gold painted over a much darker, more brutal reality. For every industrialist's fortune made, there were thousands of lives broken on the wheel of progress. For every brightly lit ballroom, there was a dark, crime-ridden alleyway where desperation festered. Historians often refer to this period as one of profound social anxiety, a battleground between the established, old-money Boston Brummels and the upstart industrialists they often viewed with contempt. This friction created a volatile social landscape. A family's reputation was a fragile currency, and a fall from grace could be swift and total. Beneath this glittering surface of high society, a ruthless underworld thrived. This was a world of unregulated capitalism, of labor disputes that were settled with hired thugs, and of clandestine financial networks that operated far from the scrutiny of the law. Shadowy syndicates, fronted by seemingly legitimate businessmen, preyed upon the overextended and the desperate, weaving webs of debt from which there was often no escape. Their methods were systematic intimidation, extortion, and, when necessary, erasure. It was a world where a man's entire legacy could be built in one decade and utterly destroyed in the next, not by a market crash, but by a quiet threat delivered in a back room. A promise of violence against those he loved most. The Whitmore family, with their new and conspicuous wealth, existed squarely on this treacherous knife's edge. Their grand mansion in Salem was a statement, a declaration of their arrival into the upper echelons. But its location was freighted with its own dark history. Salem, a name that history had already stained with the legacy of paranoia, public hysteria, and wrongful accusation, provided a fittingly somber backdrop. It was a place, some said, where the soil itself was predisposed to burying secrets. The estate was isolated, set back from the main road, surrounded by a dense thicket of ancient trees that seemed to swallow the light and muffle the sounds of the outside world. It was a private kingdom, but that privacy could so easily become a prison, in a world where powerful enemies operated in the shadows. Such isolation was not a luxury. It was a profound vulnerability. It was the perfect stage for a tragedy to unfold, far from the prying eyes of the world. It was this world of beautiful, dangerous contradictions that Rebecca Martinez carried with her, sealed within that ornate wooden frame. The drive back to her Boston antique shop was a blur. The photograph sat on the passenger seat beside her, face up, a silent passenger whose gaze she could feel even without looking. The unease from the mansion had crystallized into a focused obsession. In the clean, well-lit space of her workshop, her sanctuary of order and truth, the photograph seemed even more of an anomaly. Here, surrounded by the tools of her trade, she felt more in control. She placed it carefully on her velvet-lined work table, the faces of the 5 family members staring up at her from across the chasm of 130 years. Her initial mission was simple: clean the piece, research its provenance, and assign it a value before putting it up for sale. But she already knew this was no ordinary piece of inventory. Her hands, accustomed to the delicate dance with time-worn objects, moved with a surgeon's precision. She gently cleaned the clouded glass, then turned the frame over to examine its backing. As she unfastened the small rusted brads holding the photograph in place, she noticed the paper it was printed on was unusually thick and stiff. A high-grade, albumin silver stock from a respected French manufacturer. This was not the work of a common traveling photographer. This was a commission. This was expensive. This was deliberate. She slid the photograph from its frame and her breath caught. It felt heavy, substantial in her hands. She reached for her high-powered magnifying glass. The loop that had revealed countless secrets in the past, a hidden signature, a telltale repair, the faint trace of a forger's hand. She began her formal assessment, her mind cataloging the technical details. The photographer, she thought, was a master of the relatively new dry plate process, which allowed for shorter exposure times and unprecedented clarity. This explained the technical perfection, but it didn't explain the subjects. Her heart began to beat a little faster as she guided the lens across the image. And then she saw them. New details, fresh horrors. She focused on the mother's hand, which rested on her youngest daughter's shoulder. The fingers, she now saw with unnerving clarity, were blurred, a ghosting effect. In an image this sharp, it could only mean one thing: movement. A tremor. A violent shiver of fear that had lasted just long enough for the sensitive photographic plate to record it. Then, her eyes went to the youngest child, the little girl with the terrified eyes, a child of no more than 8. Rebecca had seen the fear. Now, she saw its direction. The child was not looking at the camera. Her gaze was directed just off to the side, at something or someone outside the frame. Her focus was absolute, her small body rigid. Her expression was not fixed on the man behind the camera, but on an unseen presence in the room. And it was in that moment that Rebecca knew. She felt a definitive shift inside her, a line being crossed. This was no longer about an antique. It was not about profit. It was an obligation to a ghost in a photograph, and to a story that had waited far, far too long to be told. That sense of obligation settled upon Rebecca with the weight of a physical shroud. It was a sudden, profound clarity that cut through the intellectual curiosity of the antiquarian and touched something far deeper, something primal, the human need for justice. A story had been suppressed, a truth silenced, and the evidence lay there on her velvet-lined table, its silent subjects pleading for a voice. For a moment, the bustling sounds of modern Boston outside her shop faded away, replaced by the imagined, oppressive quiet of that house in Salem. The weight of 130 years of silence pressed down on her, and she knew she could not bear it alone. Her hand, trembling slightly, reached not for a restoration tool, but for the telephone. But who does one call about a crime committed when Grover Cleveland was president? The police would dismiss it as fantasy. A morbid tale, spun from an old photograph. She needed someone who understood history not as a collection of dates, but as a landscape of human lives. Someone who could see the evidence with the same reverence and analytical rigor she possessed. She needed an expert. Before making the call, a compulsive urge drove her back to the photograph one last time. It was as if the image itself were pulling her in, demanding a closer look, hinting that it had not yet surrendered all of its secrets. Her eye, now trained to see malice, scanned past the faces, past the clothing, and to the background, the stage upon which this silent horror had been performed. And then she saw it. A detail she had somehow missed in her initial assessments. A detail so sinister it made the terror in the children's eyes feel like a mere prelude. On the wall behind the family, an ornate gilded mirror was partially visible, but its reflection was a lie. It did not reflect the back of the family members' heads. It did not reflect the sparse, empty room one would expect. Instead, through the chemical haze of the antique photographic process, the mirror showed what was happening in front of the family. It captured the space where the photographer should have been standing. And in that space, there was no camera on a tripod. There were figures, shadowy, indistinct forms of several men dressed in dark, heavy clothing. They were not posing. They were positioned, their stances aggressive, their hands holding what looked chillingly like restraints, ropes. One figure seemed to be gesturing, his hand raised in a command. The photograph was not just a document of the family's terror. It was a document of their captors. The photographer had not simply captured the subjects. He had captured his co-conspirators, reflected in a silent, glass witness. The cold that Rebecca had felt in the Salem mansion returned with a vengeance, a wave of ice that washed through her veins. This wasn't just a portrait of a family in distress. This was evidence of a kidnapping, an organized crime frozen in time. The name that came to her mind was that of Dr. James Harrison, a respected, if somewhat eccentric, professor of social history and early photographic arts at Harvard University. Harrison was a man who lived and breathed the 19th century. He was a notorious skeptic, a man who believed in primary sources and empirical data, not ghost stories. He was a perfect person to either validate her terrifying discovery or debunk it as a trick of light and shadow. Summoning her courage, Rebecca made the call, her voice strained as she tried to explain what she had found without sounding like a madwoman. To her surprise, after a long, skeptical silence on the other end of the line, Harrison agreed to come. It was the impossibility of the photograph's clarity, combined with the disturbing inconsistencies she described, that had piqued his academic curiosity. Dr. The Harrison arrived at Rebecca's shop the next morning. He was a tall, lean man in his late 60s, with sharp, intelligent eyes, behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and a tweed jacket that seemed permanently attached to his person. His demeanor was one of polite, professional skepticism. He greeted Rebecca with a curt nod and immediately got down to business, his eyes scanning her workshop with an appraising glance. He had seen countless historic discoveries in his career, most of which turned out to be forgeries, misinterpretations, or outright hoaxes. He expected this to be no different. "So, this is the artifact," he stated, his voice dry as he looked at the photograph lying on the table. Without waiting for a reply, he opened his leather satchel and began to remove his own tools, a high-powered stereomicroscope, archival safe gloves, and a set of specialized measuring calipers. The air in the workshop grew tense. This was no longer an amateur's assessment. It was a professional inquest. He spent the first hour in near total silence, meticulously examining the photograph under the powerful lenses of his microscope, his expression unreadable. He hummed quietly to himself, a low, academic drone. Rebecca waited, her hands clenched, feeling like a student awaiting a grade that could change her life. Finally, Harrison leaned back, removing his spectacles and rubbing his eyes. The look of polite skepticism was gone, replaced by one of profound gravity and disturbance. "The provenance is impeccable," he began, his voice now low and serious. "The paper stock, the silver gelatin emulsion, the specific character of the focus fall-off. This photograph is unquestionably authentic. It was taken in or around 1890 by a photographer of extraordinary skill, using equipment that would have been the absolute pinnacle of the era's technology." He paused, putting his spectacles back on and leaning over the microscope again. "Which makes what I am about to show you all the more disturbing." He motioned for Rebecca to look. "Observe the children's clothing," he instructed, pointing with a pair of delicate tweezers. "While the fabric is of high quality, it is disheveled. Notice the second button on the boy's waistcoat. It's in the wrong buttonhole. And the youngest girl's dress," he continued, his voice dropping further. "See the deep, vertical creases here? This garment was not being worn. It was put on her hastily, perhaps pulled from a trunk moments before the photograph was taken. It's the work of someone who didn't care for the details." only for the overall impression of formality. The pressure in the room seemed to mount with each new revelation. Harrison then guided the microscope to the patriarch, Edmund Whitmore. "I noted your observation about the averted gazes and the terror," he said, "but look closer, at his wrists." He adjusted the focus, and Rebecca gasped, "There, just peeking out from beneath the starched white cuffs of his shirt, were faint, dark abrasions on the skin. They were bruised, almost raw. The pattern was unmistakable." "These are not shadows, Doctor," Harrison said, his voice barely a whisper. "These are rope burns, or marks from iron restraints. This man was bound." The academic exercise was over. The workshop, once a place of quiet restoration, now felt like a morgue. The photograph was no longer just a portrait of fear. It was a portrait of a crime scene, its details meticulously, if unintentionally, preserved. The horror was no longer just psychological, it was physical, etched onto the very bodies of its subjects. Dr. Harrison, the man of science and skepticism, looked at Rebecca, his face pale. "This family was not posing for a portrait," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his conclusion. "They were being staged, documented like specimens." The discovery of the physical evidence changed everything. For Dr. Harrison, the photograph was no longer simply a disturbing artifact. It was a primary source document that pointed to a dark, unwritten chapter of history. The academic question of how the photo was taken was now eclipsed by a much more urgent and horrifying one: what happened to the people in it? His historian's instinct took over. He knew that an event this violent, this organized, would have left other traces in the historical record, however faint. Leaving the photograph secured in Rebecca's workshop, he retreated to his own sanctuary, the vast, silent archives of Harvard's Widener Library and the Massachusetts Historical Society. He spent the next 2 days surrounded by the ghosts of the past, the air thick with the scent of aging paper and binding glue. He methodically combed through public records, property deeds, business ledgers, and, most importantly, the microfilmed newspaper archives from the autumn of 1890. He scrolled through endless pages of advertisements for corsets and patent medicines, reports on local politics, and society gossip. He searched for any mention of the Whitmore family of Salem, a business failure, a scandal, an accident. He found nothing. They were a family of considerable wealth. Their absence from the public record was in itself a strange anomaly. He was beginning to believe the trail had gone cold, that the crime had been so perfect as to leave no echo. When he decided on a new search term, instead of looking for Whitmore, he began searching for articles related to unsolved disappearances or mysterious circumstances in Essex County during that period. The microfilm read a word, its light flickering in the dim quiet of the archive room. Page after page of the Boston Globe from October 1890 passed before his eyes. And then he stopped. The whirring ceased. The silence in the room became absolute. He leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The blood drained from his face as he read the headline. Dated October 28, 1890. It was stark, bold, and chilling. Entire Salem family vanishes. Whitmore estate found abandoned. Residents gone without a trace. His breath fogged the cool glass of the reader. The academic curiosity that had propelled him here was gone, replaced by the cold, heavy certainty of a historian who has just stumbled upon a tomb. He read the article, and then the follow-up articles from the ensuing weeks, his horror growing with every line. The reports detailed a scene of eerie normalcy at the mansion. Doors were unlocked. A half-eaten meal was left on the dining room table. There were no signs of a struggle, no ransom note, no witnesses. It was as if the 5 members of the Whitmore family had simply ceased to exist. The case had become one of Massachusetts' most enduring and perplexing mysteries. A local legend told to frighten children. Until now. Dr. Harrison leaned back, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. He was holding the two ends of a story that had been torn apart 130 years ago. In his mind, he saw the newspaper headline on one side and the terrifying, perfect photograph on the other. They were not two separate mysteries. They were the beginning and the end of the same horrifying event. The people in that photograph, the family with the haunted eyes and the secret marks of bondage, were not just anonymous subjects of a dark image. They were the lost souls at the center of a famous, unsolved crime. The photograph was not just evidence of their final moments. It was the case's long-lost Rosetta Stone. That single static, flickering headline on the microfilm screen was the connecting bolt of lightning between two eras. In the hallowed quiet of the archive, Dr. Harrison, a man of the past, understood that he had reached the absolute limit of his discipline. History could pose the question. It could identify the players. It could even point to the crime. But it could not prosecute. It could not give the Whitmore family the justice they were denied. The photograph was indeed a Rosetta Stone, but one whose language was not just of history, but of forensics. And for that, he needed a different kind of expert. He needed someone who did not just study the dead, but spoke for them in the language of evidence and law. The following day, Dr. Harrison sat in the stark-done, modern office of Detective Sarah Chen, a specialist in the cold case unit of the Massachusetts State Police. Chen was a woman whose sharp, focused gaze seemed to see the world in layers of evidence. She had a reputation for her relentless tenacity and an almost unnerving empathy for the victims in the long-forgotten files that cluttered her desk. She listened with professional patience as Dr. Harrison laid out the story, her expression carefully neutral. She had heard countless theories born from folklore and speculation. But then, Harrison produced the photograph. He didn't place the original on her desk, but a series of high-resolution digital scans he had commissioned. As she clicked through the images on her monitor, her practiced neutrality began to dissolve. The academic curiosity of the historian was replaced by the sharp, analytical focus of the investigator. She saw the fear in the eyes, the disheveled clothing, the subtle marks of bondage. And then Harrison directed her to the final image, an enhanced close-up of the mirror. For the first time, Detective Chen leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. The shadowy figures, the ropes, the menacing postures. This was no longer a historical curiosity. This was a crime scene. "I'm opening an unofficial inquiry," she stated, her voice calm but firm, the decision already made. "This photograph needs to be analyzed by my forensic imaging unit immediately." The photograph, now treated as a priceless piece of evidence, was transported to the State Forensic Laboratory. There, under conditions of controlled light and temperature, a team of specialists subjected it to technologies the original photographer could not have fathomed. Using advanced digital enhancement algorithms, they sharpened the reflection in the mirror, peeling back the layers of chemical aging and photographic haze. The results were more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. Computer analysis confirmed the figures were undeniably human forms, their threatening stances algorithmically verified. But the technology revealed more. One of the specialists, using a technique called reflective transformation imaging, which captures and synthesizes images under dozens of different lighting angles. Noticed something on the surface of the mirror's ornate frame within the photograph itself. He called Chen into the darkened lab. On the monitor was a 3D rendering of the frame's surface. "There are scratches here," the specialist said, pointing to a section of the gilded wood. "They're microscopic, deliberate, not accidental wear. Someone carved something." He typed a command, and the software re-rendered the image, exaggerating the depth of the scratches, making them legible. 2 words emerged from the past, etched by a desperate hand in a moment of unimaginable terror. 2 words that transformed the photograph from a passive record of a crime into an active plea. "Help us." The 2 words, glowing on the screen, gave Detective Chen the legal and moral authority she needed. The photograph was now officially declared evidence in a 130-year-old probable homicide case. The Whitmore estate, so long a silent tomb, was about to be searched again, not by antique dealers, but by a modern forensic team armed with the tools to make old houses speak. Days later, the silence of the Whitmore mansion was broken by the clinical hum of generators and the methodical commands of a forensic investigation team. Detective Chen stood in the grand foyer, the air still thick with the scent of decay, but now mingled with the sterile smell of latex and chemical reagents. Her team, equipped with ground-penetrating radar, luminol, and infrared cameras, began a systematic sweep of the property. They were searching for the one thing the original investigators in 1890 had missed, the thing that could finally provide a voice for the victims, their bodies. For days, the search yielded nothing but confirmation of the house's sad decline. The cellar, with its damp stone walls and earthen floor, was a place of particular focus. It felt ancient, a place where secrets could easily be absorbed by the cold, forgiving ground. The radar showed disturbances in the soil, but excavations revealed only old pipes and forgotten debris. The investigation was hitting a wall. The house, it seemed, was determined to keep its secrets. But Chen, haunted by the image of the children's eyes, refused to give up. She had a feeling, a detective's intuition, that the family's final testament was here somewhere, hidden not by dirt, but by ingenuity. It was on the final day of the scheduled search that a junior officer, running a resonance scan along the foundation walls of the cellar, got an anomalous reading. Behind a crumbling section of a 19th century furnace base, the stone wall was not as thick as it should have been. It sounded hollow. With painstaking care, the team removed the loose stones, and there, in the cold, dark cavity behind them, was a small lead-lined box, protected from the damp of a century. Inside, wrapped in what was once fine silk, were a few personal belongings, a small wooden soldier, a child's silver locket, and a small leather-bound diary. The name, Margaret Whitmore, was embossed in faded gold on its cover. A reverent silence fell over the team as Chen carefully opened the book. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the handwriting, that of a young, educated girl, was mostly legible. The early entries spoke of lessons, parties, and the small joys of a privileged life. But as the entries for October 1890 began, the tone shifted. The elegant script grew shaky, frantic. She wrote of strange men visiting her father, of hushed, angry arguments behind closed doors. She wrote of her father's growing desperation, her mother's constant, silent tears, and a house that had transformed from a home into a prison. And then came the final entry. It was dated the same day the team believed the photograph had been taken. The handwriting was a barely legible scrawl, the page stained with what forensic analysis would later confirm were teardrops. Margaret Whitmore, in her final moments, had become the sole witness to her family's annihilation. "They came back today," the entry began. "Papa is crying. They are angry men, their voices like stones. They made us dress in our finest clothes. They said we must be brave and smile for a picture for a man with a camera. Mama holds my hand so tightly, her nails digging into my palm. She says to be brave, but I see the truth in her eyes. I can hear them talking in the hall about what happens next, about making an example. I'm so scared. I fear we will not see another sunrise. If anyone ever finds this, please remember us. Remember us as we were, not as they want us to look." The diary entry was the confession, not of the guilty, but of the innocent. It was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. A voice crying out from a hidden grave. It confirmed Chen's worst fears. The photograph was not a trophy. It was a proof of life. Taken moments before that life was extinguished, it was a meticulously crafted instrument of terror. A message to be sent to other debtors. A warning written in the currency of a family's fear. Margaret's diary gave the investigation its soul. Now, Detective Chen needed to expose its dark heart. The question was no longer what happened, but why. The answer, she suspected, lay not in the dust of the mansion, but in the cold, hard numbers of Edmund Whitmore's business dealings. Chen and her team dove back into the archives, but this time they looked beyond property deeds and census data. They pulled court records, bankruptcy filings, and private business ledgers from the 1880s and 1890s, painting a grim picture of Edmund Whitmore's final months. His textile business, once a source of immense pride and wealth, had been failing. A series of bitter labor disputes and what historical accounts described as financial mismanagement had left him deeply vulnerable. To save his empire, Whitmore had borrowed heavily, but he had not gone to a conventional bank. He had turned to a shadowy consortium of private investors, a group with questionable backgrounds and rumored connections to Boston's burgeoning organized crime networks. The interest rates were predatory, the terms unforgiving. In a dusty box of court files related to the liquidation of Whitmore's estate, Chen found what she was looking for: a series of letters sent to Whitmore in the months before his family's disappearance. They were preserved as evidence in a forgotten civil suit. The letters began with firm demands for repayment, but their tone quickly escalated. They became threatening, then violent. The final letters, written on expensive letterhead but with an aggressive, spidery script, were explicit. They threatened not just Whitmore, but his wife and children. One letter contained a particularly chilling phrase: "Your failure to honor your commitments will result in an example being made of your entire family, one that will serve as a permanent warning to all our other associates." The pieces were now locking into place with horrifying speed, but one piece of the puzzle still troubled Chen, the photographer. Who was the artist forced to document this atrocity? Her research into professional photographers active in the Boston area in 1890 led her to a man named Marcus Crane. Crane was a celebrated artist, known for his technical innovation and striking portraits. But his personal life was a different story. Financial records showed he was drowning in debt himself. More disturbingly, Court dockets revealed that Crane had been hired on several occasions by debt collection agencies to document the assets of estates facing foreclosure. He was their inventory man. His skills were being used for intimidation. The final, tragic link came from the Massachusetts Historical Society's own archives in a collection of private family letters. Chen found correspondence from Marcus Crane's wife, written to her sister in late 1890. Her letters described her husband's growing fear and desperation, his involvement with dangerous people to whom he owed money. The last letter, dated just days before Crane himself disappeared from Boston, was a wife's terrified premonition. "Marcus came home last night, shaking and pale," she wrote. "He said they have asked him to do something terrible, something that goes against everything he believes in as an artist and a man. He is terrified, but he says he has no choice. I fear for our family if he refuses, but I fear for his soul if he complies." Chen now had the full, horrifying picture: a desperate father, a ruthless criminal syndicate, and a terrified artist, all caught in a web of debt that would ultimately consume them all in one of the 19th century's most brutal and meticulously executed crimes. With the full, horrifying picture now assembled, Detective Sarah Chen's role shifted from investigator to historian, and finally to harbinger. The evidence she had gathered formed a comprehensive and damning report, a document that was not merely a closing of a cold case, but a rewriting of a chapter in New England's history. It was a formal accusation, leveled across the chasm of 130 years, against men whose crimes had been so perfect they had dissolved into the mists of time, leaving behind only legacies of wealth and influence, because no criminal charges could be filed against ghosts. The report was presented not to a prosecutor, but to the court of public opinion and historical record, in collaboration with the Massachusetts Historical Society. The release of the findings sent a seismic shockwave through the upper echelons of Boston society. Names that had adorned university halls, hospital wings, and charitable foundations for generations were now linked to a monstrous criminal enterprise. The truth caused a quiet, yet devastating, collapse. It was a collapse not of buildings, but of reputations, a slow, agonizing implosion of family mythologies built upon a foundation of extortion and murder. There were no public condemnations or dramatic confessions. Instead, there was a series of quiet, significant actions. Several prominent families, descendants of the original syndicate members, issued veiled public statements expressing deep sorrow over historical injustices and made substantial, anonymous donations to victims' rights organizations and historical preservation societies. It was an act of atonement performed in the shadows, a tacit admission of a guilt so profound and old it could only be addressed with money, not words. The history of the Gilded Age in Massachusetts was officially redefined. The Whitmore case, once a footnote in books on unsolved mysteries, was now a central case study in criminology and history courses focused on organized crime in America, including a required reading paper published by a humbled and deeply affected Dr. Harrison. The narrative was no longer about a family that simply vanished. It was now the definitive story of the brutal efficiency of a criminal syndicate and the terrible price of unchecked greed. The void left by the Whitmore family's disappearance was finally filled, not with speculation, but with a truth more terrible than any local legend had ever dared to imagine. In the wake of this historical reckoning, the artifacts that had started it all found their final rightful places. The photograph, that beautiful and terrible object, was donated by Rebecca Martinez to the Massachusetts Historical Society. She stated in a quiet ceremony that she could never have profited from it, knowing it was not a portrait, but a headstone. It was placed in a permanent, climate-controlled exhibit, its exceptional clarity now serving not as a point of artistic pride, but as an eternal testament to a family's final moments of terror. Margaret Whitmore's diary, its pages brittle with age and stained with tears, was placed alongside it. The two items, a public image and a private cry for help, were finally reunited, telling their complete, heartbreaking story to all who would listen. The investigation left an indelible mark on the three individuals who had unearthed the truth. Rebecca Martinez became a fierce advocate for ethical practices in the antique trade, establishing protocols for handling items that might be connected to historical crimes. She no longer saw objects merely for their beauty or value, but as potential witnesses waiting to speak. Dr. Harrison's academic work took on a new, more humanistic depth, forever colored by the knowledge that behind the dry data of history are the real, beating hearts of those who lived it. And Detective Sarah Chen, with the success of the Whitmore case, was appointed director of a newly established cold case unit dedicated specifically to historical crimes, ensuring that other forgotten victims might one day have their stories told. Yet, a haunting legacy remains. In the final pages of Chen's report is an appendix she compiled herself. It lists 6 other wealthy families from the same era who vanished under similarly mysterious circumstances after borrowing from the same network of investors. No photographs have been found for them. No diaries have been unearthed. They remain whispers in the archive, their fates officially unsolved. The full, monstrous scale of the syndicate's activities, the true number of their victims, is a lingering secret that may be forever lost to time. A chilling reminder that for every story that is brought to light, countless others remain buried in eternal silence. And so, we are left with the photograph, an object of terrible beauty, a moment in time that was meant to be a warning to debtors, but which became, through a series of unlikely events, a final, successful plea for justice. It forces us to ask a difficult question: how many other silent witnesses like it are hanging on walls or hidden in dusty attics? Their ordinary surfaces concealing extraordinary tragedies. Margaret Whitmore's last wish, scrawled in the dark of her family's final hours, was not for revenge, but for remembrance. "Remember us as we were," she wrote, "not as they want us to look." Thanks to the courage of those who refused to let their story fade, we finally can. We can look past the rigid formality of the pose, past the expensive clothing, and past the perfect, chilling clarity of the image. We see the truth that was always there, reflected in the eyes of the children. We see not a symbol of status, but a family, a loving family, huddling together in their final moments, their lives about to be stolen by greed and violence, whose memory deserved to be honored, and whose truth deserved, at long last, to be set free. The story of the Whitmore family serves as an enduring, somber warning that the past is never truly past, and that if we look closely enough, if we listen hard enough to the silence, history itself will eventually point the way to the bodies.